tomorrow's national by-elections will be the biggest in the country's history and comes during a pandemic and with tight budget cuts. On what we're calling now Super Wednesday, 107 seats will be up for grabs in 95 wards across the country. IEC Chief Electoral Officer Ayanda Nyathi has announced added strict safety measures, including social distancing inside and outside voting stations, the mandatory wearing of face masks and the replacement of indelible ink pens with liquid. For more on Super Wednesday, let's bring in now Deputy Chief Electoral Officer of the IEC, that's Masego Sheburi. Mr. Sheburi, thanks very much for your time. Welcome to the AM Report. Certainly feels like crunch time, isn't it? We're just hours away from these by-elections. As a start, do you get the impression that there hasn't been as much awareness, campaigning, for lack of a better term, around these elections as there would for other contestations in the past? And if so, what can we attribute that to?
Thanks for the opportunity. I think the level of interest in this by-election is certainly unprecedented. The level of media support, I think, was a key driver for the interest, as well as the initiative that we took to inform voters who are affected by the ward vacancies of the fact that there is an opportunity for them to participate in shaping affairs of their communities by selecting people who will represent them in those wards.
I mean, the impression I got, and perhaps you might disagree with me, is that in fact there hasn't been as much, call it song and dance, about these elections, at least not in the past week or so. Many people, in fact, learning just yesterday for the first time that these by-elections are being held. Is that the impression you get too?
No, the impression we get in quite the opposite impression. Right. For by-elections, we hardly ever get opportunities to speak on national TV, and we've been doing interviews almost since the by-elections were announced. For purposes of registration, we open our voting stations on the 3rd and the 4th, and there again we saw a significant presence in our voting stations, person coming to check their details and those who are registering for the first time. So certainly from a coverage perspective, we are grateful for channels like yourself for spreading the news on the impending by-elections.
All right, very well then. In the backdrop, what's also taking place, Ayanda Nyathi announcing, I think it was yesterday, that there are budget cuts of up to 130 million rand in the works for the next financial year. We'll speak about the implications in just a moment, but are you able to share with us how much it's costing to run these unprecedented by-elections, not least of which because you had to spend millions on things like PPE?
The budget for the by-elections would have been the budget that we have ordinarily. The additional spend is occasioned by the necessary expenditure that we must incur to make sure that we keep our staff safe, but more importantly that we keep the voting population safe. In that regard, we estimate that for by-elections on the 11th and on the 9th of December, we've spent just under 3 million just on PPEs to safeguard voting staff as well as participating voters.
Are you able to give us an idea of the total spend then? So 3 million for PPE, how much did that boost the total amount of money you're spending on these by-elections?
I think a rough estimate would be we'll place the expenditure at about 11 million, but we'll only know once we've paid off all the costs that we've incurred as they relate to the cost of temporary stations, the cost of renting voting stations, the cost of procurement for the by-elections material, as well as the payment of staff that we use as officials at the voting stations.
So 11 million for these by-elections. I imagine being able to spend this much of money in a by-election in the future is going to be increasingly difficult, again, given those budget cuts for the next financial year. And typically, you also need to trim other things like perhaps programs that were in the works for the IEC. Has the Commission been able to wrap its head around how you're going to move forward with less money, essentially, where you might be trimming, at least as a start?
The reality is that the entirety of the state has had to occasion cuts to their budget to respond to the difficulty that the country is going through. On our part, we've looked at other projects. So, for example, there are projects that we have postponed for the next year. For next year already, we know that we cannot afford the 2 registration weekends. So we've cut one registration weekend. We'll have one registration weekend in preparation for LGE 2021. We've had to cut on staff costs as well as to rethink our ability to do voter education and civic outreach. So we will be pushing a lot of content onto mobile and digital platforms and lessen traditional face-to-face engagements. The budget cuts are rolling. It's 118 million for this year. It increases in the 2 years subsequent. So our review must also cater for those periods, and those are very difficult periods because we have an election in one of those years.
Yeah, precisely, and that's where I was going with this. You know, we are approaching an incredibly important time, to put it mildly, for the IEC come the next elections. And if, the situation in the United States and many other places around the world is anything to go by, we're certainly seeing, call it an awakened interest in, engaging in politics in countries. Unprecedented number of people coming to vote in the US election. I think it's fair to say we're expecting really big numbers come our general elections in a few years' time. Are you not concerned about these huge budget cuts? 180 million is a lot of money, even if it's spread across 2 years.
We are certainly concerned, and the Commission will be engaging with the Ministry of Finance to see what it is that can be done, even as the country struggles, to ensure that the elections next year are not imperiled by the budgetary cuts. But on our part, we are willing to work with Treasury to occasion all those necessary cuts to bring us within budget. But certainly it will be difficult to deliver a free, fair and safe election in the context of COVID with the impending budget cuts. When we finalized our budget 3 years back, COVID was not in the horizon. We didn't know about it. And we know now that we must spend more to make sure that we safeguard people's lives at the voting station, both for our staff and for voting public. And that money was not budgeted for. It's money that we must find from elsewhere, even in the context of the cuts that we are seeing on our baseline budget.
All right then. Give me an idea of, let's speak about tomorrow, an idea of where you're most concerned things might not go necessarily according to plan, for whatever reason. For us, a big interest, of course, is on hotly contested areas, and in fact we've got a graphic on the screen now where we're estimating control could change. Are there any, call it hotspot areas, that you are on the lookout for in the lead up to tomorrow?
For now, the biggest concern will be rainy weather and its impact on the rate of participation. At 8 o'clock this morning, we'll open voting stations at which special votes have been approved to facilitate the participation of 23,000 people who will be voting by special vote because they are either unable to go to a voting station or that they will be outside of their ward of ordinary registration on the by-election date tomorrow. On our part, other than those municipalities at which a win or lose for the party holding the seat results in a hung or changes the power dynamics in the municipality, which we're putting specific emphasis on those. We're also looking at instances where, owing to community protest, there may be disturbances to our projects. We're working with the South African Police Services to ensure that they assist us in those instances, as well as working with the party liaison committees at all the municipalities in which there are by-elections. Whatever problem that we may encounter, I don't think they are insurmountable by South African people.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks very much for coming through and helping us understand a bit better some of the finer details in the lead up to tomorrow's unprecedented by-election. Masego Sheburi is the IEC Deputy Chief Electoral Officer. And I wonder whether you are even aware that we have by-elections as soon as tomorrow. Apparently there are about 600,000 people who've registered to vote. I imagine if you are surprised, you are not one of them.